Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. We're back for another conversation about Fredericksburg, and let's meet another soldier from the ranks. But in order to do that, let's meet our friend and author and National Park Ranger, Matt Borders. Matt, thanks for spending some more time with us here at Civil War Digital Digest.
As ever, Will, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. And before we go too much further, let me throw a quick shout out of thanks to the CWDD Coffee Grinders. They are our patrons on patreon.com. They each give a little bit of money each month, and that adds up to cover a lot of the operating expenses we have. The other thing that does is we give 15% of that to preservation right away. We're going to talk about a major preservation organization in a little bit, and we've given to them as well as other entities. Let's get back to it. So, Matt, we know you've written the book with Joe Stahl, Faces of Union Soldiers at Fredericksburg. It's the third in the series. We're going to pick up and find another soldier today from that book. Who are we going to talk about more?
Well, we're going to talk about Sergeant Jacob Heffelfinger. So there's a heck of a name. He is with the 7th Pennsylvania Reserves. I think that's probably the regimental name that you and your subscribers will be most familiar with, but of course they're also known as the 36th Pennsylvania.
Okay, well, hold on. What gives a regiment with 2 regimental designations? I know I've heard some regiments switched at some point, especially in Confederacy, but what's going on here? Talk to me a little more about these guys.
Absolutely. The Pennsylvania Reserves are somewhat unique. Pennsylvania, at the beginning of the war, it has a quota of soldiers that it is supposed to put into the field with the rest of the federal states of the original 75,000 that Lincoln calls for. And the state of Pennsylvania pretty quickly realizes it's going to need a lot more men than that. And so they get permission from the state to actually develop the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps. So 29 regiments are going to be sent forth from the state of Pennsylvania. The regiments that are developed after that for quite some time are the Pennsylvania Reserves. If you want to know their official designation with the United States government, you take the PA reserve number and add 29.
So 36th is 7th.
Yep. So the 36th PA is the 7th PA Reserves.
Before we go to Sergeant Heffelfinger, let's stay a little more global. Let's stay with the 7th Reserves. Where are these guys on the field?
7th Reserves are in the southern end of the field. They're actually going to be down there at Slaughter Pen Farm, as it becomes known, and they are part of Major General George Gordon Meade's Pennsylvania Reserve Division. So he's got 3 brigades of PA Reserves, and the 7th PA is with those troops. They would be part of the troops attacking across the flat fields of Slaughter Pen Farm towards Prospect Hill, and they will succeed in breaching that Confederate defensive line along Prospect Hill, at least for a brief time.
Great. Well, I mentioned a moment ago to everybody that we would go ahead and talk about a preservation organization. We wouldn't have really known popularly what the Slaughter Pen Farm is if it weren't for an entity. I've introduced them before. I'll give you the chance. Go ahead and introduce who we're talking about.
Absolutely. We're talking about the American Battlefield Trust. And the Trust has done some great preservation work across the country, including recently purchasing what we now call Slaughter Pen Farm. And these fields where these very men that we wrote about in the book actually advanced across, were eventually repulsed and withdraw back through.
Let's go ahead. Introduce us to our hero of the day, Sergeant Heffelfinger.
He is actually going to be a fairly typical recruit for the time. He's born about 1840, actually December 15th, 1840, in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. And he is a student before the war, attending the Cumberland Institute, and was briefly an educator as well before he enlisted. According to one of his comrades that left a diary behind, when speaking of Heffelfinger, he wrote that he entered the Army with a sense of duty to his God and his country. So that's the sort of man we're talking about right away. He's going to muster in with Company H of the 7th PA Reserves on May 28, 1861. And he'll make sergeant by November. So they recognize his role as a leader and as a responsible individual pretty early on. He's going to be wounded at Gaines Mill in June of 1862 during that intense fighting on the peninsula. And the 7 days that follow, the PA reserves are heavily involved in the fighting down there, and he would be wounded in the right thigh. He is actually going to walk on said wounded leg back to an aid station where he would then be captured. Now, this will be the first of several times that Heffelfinger will be captured throughout the war. He is actually going to spend about a month as a guest of the Confederate government in Richmond, and then he is going to be paroled. And he spends time recuperating in both the Chesapeake General Hospital at Fortress Monroe and then the General Hospital in Annapolis, Maryland as well. Due to this period of recuperation, he is going to miss the Second Bull Run campaign and the Maryland campaign and returns to the 7th PA Reserves on November 8th. Now, when it comes to Fredericksburg, Heffelfinger is going to advance with the rest of George Gordon Meade's PA Reserves across, as we said, Slaughter Pen Farm, and they are going to be attacking towards Prospect Hill. And it would be in the process of moving across these fields, and I believe probably as they're just beginning to move across the railroad line into the wooded area of Prospect Hill, that he is going to be hit again. He is actually going to be shot through both of his legs this time, the enfilading fire coming down the length of the line. He would actually have a diary with him and continue to record what's going on around him after he has fallen. He comments that he doesn't want to call for aid as the men are moving forward because he doesn't want to pull strength from the fighting line. And then as his comrades are pushed back, he doesn't call for aid again because he doesn't want them to potentially be captured themselves while aiding him. In fact, he would write in his diary while laying there on the ground wounded, bleeding from both of his legs, that all that we gained at so fearful a cost is lost. I am still lying where I fell. The rebels have advanced a line over me so that I am a prisoner. Now, due to the extent of his injuries, he is actually going to be exchanged pretty quickly. Okay, he's going to be exchanged on December 19th, so he's not with the Confederates very long. He would be sent back to Annapolis to recuperate, and he would not be able to return to the 7th PA Reserves until mid-April of 63. But over this period of recuperation, he's actually been promoted twice. So he is now a first lieutenant by the time he returns to the regiment. So he's an officer now. And fortunately for him, fortunately for the 7th PA Reserves and many of the other Pennsylvania Reserve regiments, the rest of 1863 is spent in the defenses of Washington. So he's not going to have to put too much stress on these recently healed up legs. And then in 64, the PA Reserves are called out once more, rejoining the Army of the Potomac to begin the Overland Campaign in the spring of 64. And it would be during the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th of 64 that Heffelfinger, along with the majority of the 7th PA Reserves, will be captured. Okay, for those of you familiar with the...
That's his third time being captured, right?
That is his third time being captured.
Wow.
And this is the long one. Okay, he is basically out for the rest of the fight. Because what's going to happen is the 7th PA Reserves is almost entirely captured. This is something of a rarity in the Civil War, but the regiment is gobbled up. And he, being an officer, will be sent to an officer's prison camp. Specifically, he is sent to Camp Asylum outside of Columbia, South Carolina. It is built on the grounds of the state insane asylum, thus the name. And he would remain there until March 1st of 1865. So he is there a long time. He will muster out of the service on March 11th. So he is exchanged on the 1st, and 10 days later, he's out of the service. He will receive a brevet for his actions at the Battle of the Wilderness on the 13th of March, interestingly enough, and for his gallant conduct at the Wilderness, and so he's made a captain there at the very end of his service.
So what does he go on to do after the war?
It's fascinating, actually. What happens is some folks might use the term carpetbagger, but in '66 he actually moves to Hampton, Virginia. We have to remember, he had spent quite a bit of time down in that part of the world in '62 during the Peninsula Campaign and the 7 Days. Apparently, he was struck by it, but he is going to move to Hampton, Virginia, and becomes a resident of that town for the rest of his life. He's going to be a 50-year resident of Hampton, Virginia by the time he finally passes away in 1915.
Wow.
Yeah, and he is really a feature of the town. He is going to become involved in both the lumber and the coal industry. He's going to raise a family, has at least 3 boys in his family. He will be heavily involved in the church there in Hampton. And he is going to become something of an amateur historian and archaeologist. He is going to find the foundation of the original church that was built at the first settlement that is now Hampton, Virginia, and then he wrote the history of the town for its 300th anniversary, and presented that paper to the town.
Wow, fantastic! And lives until 1915, so many decades after the war.
Many, and to this day, there is still a Heffelfinger Street named after him in Hampton, Virginia.
Wow, fantastic. Well, Matt, there's a real story of life and of service. Give you a chance here. Wrap the man up and give me your thoughts on him now that you've been able to hang out with him, probably more than even the rest of us have.
This is a guy who doesn't quit. That's what was particularly impressive to me about Heffelfinger. He's thrice wounded, thrice captured, and yet he is always willing to go back at it. You'd think he would be looking, especially after he becomes an officer, because we got to remember, Will, officers have a lot more leeway to get things like furloughs, to get reasons to get out of service and things like that. And Heffelfinger never does that. And so he really impresses me, not only for persevering through injury and capture, but also his willingness to not take advantage of his situation.
Great way to say it. So, well, thank you for suggesting him as we've developed these episodes. You've been key in saying, hey, let's talk about this person, let's talk about this person. And I feel like I've got a better handle on yet another face that comes out of the Civil War and is now not just a face, but a name and a man and, heck, a street and a town still there.
That's right.
So, well, thanks for spending the time with us, Matt. We appreciate you bringing the story.
Most definitely.
So, well, thank you for being with us at Civil War Digital Digest. We keep that watchword of connection, and Matt's really brought us for us again today. Just a soldier who just wouldn't quit, and a man who wouldn't quit, as it looks like as he goes later into his life. Pick up the book, find the stories, find your own connection to history, whether it's this way or whether it's another way. We hope you do and enjoy it. We'll see you down the road.